Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. I am Ujjwal Kango, a doctoral student at IIM Calcutta, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on Radio Sophia. Radio Sophia is a virtual platform to discuss various academic and non academic discussions on various socio-economic and political issues. It aims to facilitate a dialogue amongst researchers, practitioners, and general public. This week at Radio Sophia, we discuss the politics of the policy reforms that were passed by the Parliament of India during the pandemic. A lot of people find the policies around privatization, agricultural and labor reforms a terribly dense topic, and they are not entirely wrong. The politics around these policies in India can be quite complicated, and I'm not going to pretend that I understand these issues and attempt to say something very insightful. Thankfully, today we have amongst us Professor Rajesh Bhattacharya, a reputed political economist who currently teaches at IIM Calcutta in the Public Policy and Management Group. His research interests lie in the domains of informal economy, urban political economy, and social sector policies. So now over to you, sir.
Thanks, Ujjwal. Am I coming through clear for everyone?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks for this opportunity. I guess I get about 40 minutes or so for talking, and then we can, I can take questions. Is that format okay, Ujjwal?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So uh, let me begin by saying that one could go on talking about the politics surrounding the pandemic, the current pandemic, uh, for long, because it's not just one set of politics we can talk about. There is, of course, the politics surrounding the pandemic in the way the pandemic is being discussed, being understood, and being handled. That's one set of politics, and that's not very easy to understand itself. A lot is being and a lot more will be written about this pandemic in future. It is one of those rare events in global history that laid bare the tensions between individuals, classes, between genders, and other social groups that otherwise remain invisible to most, though always they are there, they're smoldering beneath the calm surface of everyday life. The pandemic also tore at the fundamental ties between individuals comprising a society. One can say even a family, neighbors, and definitely at the way citizens relate to the state. So all of these are very remarkable revelations during the pandemic to people who were otherwise accustomed to certain set notions. Those notions seem to have been upended by the pandemic. This is happening in India also. However, India had something very special going on before and during the pandemic, which sort of, I would argue, marked this period as one of the most critical in its history as a sovereign independent nation. Just to give an idea of what was existing, just what was happening in India just before the pandemic hit, remember that the pandemic hit India in the middle of one of the finest episodes of democratic protest in independent India. I'm talking about the peaceful demonstrations against CA, NRC, the two blades of the scissor that threatens the very connection of the people with the nation. It was halted, these protest demonstrations were halted by the most dramatic nationwide lockdown that the world has seen anywhere during the pandemic. That's one side. That was something that was unprecedented in India's democratic history itself. The other thing that was very unprecedented and which was going on for several years actually was an economic trend. And in today's topic, I'll be focusing more on the economic policies, not the other set of very controversial and contentious policies that have been, that have been promulgated or are being discussed for possible legislation currently. I'll be focusing more on the economic policies. And since that is the case, I would spend a little bit of time on the other trend before the pandemic. Uh, but the first point that I mentioned, the demonstrations, the democratic protest movements against CA/NRC is important to keep in mind, because at the end we will talk about the connection between politics, policy, and democracy. But let's turn to the second trend that I was referring to, and that is the trend of pronounced economic downturn in India in the years leading up to the pandemic. And I'm talking about at least 3-4 years, if not more, uh, since 2016-17, that the downturn is visible. GDP growth in India has been declining since a high of 8.2% in 2016-17 to 5% in the year 2019-20, as per the official advanced estimates. Now, many of you may be familiar with the problems and the challenges in interpreting the shift in methodology of calculating national income statistics, and the continuous debates that's going on about the statistics themselves. But even if we accept those statistics, economy has been slowing down since 2016-17, and people have argued that that was because of the twin shocks of demonetization and somewhat shoddily implemented GST, if not shoddily designed GST. However, many experts also believe that the figures, those that show the decline, the figures themselves might be overstated. So the decline might be even more pronounced. What we know is that just before the lockdown began in the January-March quarter of 2020, 1920, the financial 1920, India's economy expanded by just 3.1%. And the GDP growth has been on a fall since the last 8 quarters, ending in January, March, before the lockdown kicked in. Now, why is it important? Because since 2019, when India's growth rate reached a peak of about 8-9%, and India was being touted as the fastest growing country, sort of nipping at the heels of China and so on, and it appeared like export oriented, outsourcing driven, IT enabled growth path would actually lead India down the path of East Asian countries as they experience such growth paths in the 80s and so on. Just as we crossed just as we reached that height of 8-9%, it started on a slowdown, imperceptible in many ways to begin with, but later on it became more and more visible. At the same time, we were talking about a possible demographic dividend, and as you all know, that a demographic dividend is a kind of benefit, economic benefit, that any country derives because of the composition of its working age population relative to non-working age population, and that benefit of younger people joining the labor force, earning, saving, and therefore investing is available for only a window of time, let's say 2 or 3 decades, and therefore India was going to go through that window. That window was available to India, and the slowdown was happening precisely when India was supposed to derive the demographic dividend. So two things happened: that comparison between India and China in terms of fast growth sort of did not apply after 2010 when the slowdown starts, and a new problem emerged. What to do with the burgeoning labor force, primarily composed of very young people. Could that demographic dividend turn into a demographic disaster? That was the big worry. To put in perspective, what is happening, one needs to go back about roughly, 4 decades or more than that, to the late 60s, early 70s, when after 2 decades of economic growth via 5-year planning, it was discovered that unemployment was rising, poverty was rising, and that was the very early years of the 1970s. And as you know, as a result, there was major political instability in the country. There was radical overhaul in the policies. In fact, all the poverty alleviation programs begin in the 70s as a response to the economic and political crisis of sharp deceleration in growth and rising poverty and unemployment in the late 16 70s. So today's situation is more or less the same as in the early 70s. Um, all data seem to also point to that. Now, as you know, that there is a national sample survey, survey conducted every 5 years on household consumer expenditure, which basically gives us the average expenditure on goods and services and helps us get estimates of household monthly consumer expenditure, from which we derive our estimates of poverty. The latest survey the report was supposed to come out in 2017-18 or soon after, but the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation have decided not to release the results of this All India survey data, because of some adverse findings. However, it got leaked in the newspapers, and the leaked data shows that the average amount of money spent by an Indian in a monthly expenditure fell by 3.7% between 2011-12 to 2017-18. So it fell. It not only did not rise, it fell. This was precisely the findings in the early 1970s. In the NSSO surveys, but more important, in one of our most seminal articles by Dandekar and Roth, who showed that despite all the all the hype about the growth rates and the 5-year plans, poverty had increased. So this is happening for the first time in 40 years, or more than 40 years, a fall in consumer expenditure. This has not happened in any time in this last 40 years. The last time, the last survey that was put out for public was in 2011-12, and there the consumer expenditure registered a rise of 13% over a period of 2 years. And here, if the leaked report is somewhere close to the correct version, though the government said it's a draft version, it has not been checked and corrected. But if there's some truth there, then over the 5-year period, or more than that, actually over the 6-year period, it fell by 3.7%, as opposed to a rise of 13% between 2019 and 11-12. So evidently, there's something going on. And again, people who have had access to that leaked report said that absolute poverty went up by nearly 1 percentage point, from 21.9% in 2011-12 to 22.8% in 2017-18. Now, one may say it's just a 1 percentage point rise in poverty rate, which is modest, of course, but we want us to think about this in the context of a reversal of a long-term declining trend in poverty. Never since the 90s had the poverty rate gone up. And this 1 percentage rise in the poverty rate translates into 30 million people falling back into the ranks of the poor in the 6 years in this decade. And one striking finding is that this poverty rate went up by 4 percentage points in rural India, and actually declined by 5 percentage points in urban India. So rural India was hurt badly by this rise in poverty. It was not in urban India, but rural India where it happened. So we are talking about an economic downturn that is sort of unprecedented, not only in our lifetime. Basically, we are talking about something remarkable happening since 1970s. Now, why? What are the other implications? What other indicators show that we are in a similar situation? Those of you who have some knowledge of Indian economic history, just broad idea, you would know that the deceleration in the late 60s and 70s was because of slowdown in the private investment. So the government can invest, the private sector can invest, and the slowdown in the late 60s or 70s was because of a loss in appetite among private investors, and a similar loss is also being seen now. So the investment rate as a percent of GDP peaked at 38% in 2007-8, that is just before the global financial crash, and thereafter continued to decline steadily to about 30% in 2017-18. Same with the savings rate, which fell from 36% to 29%. Now, why am I pointing this out is because that these are sort of trends that remind us of, again, the period I've been referring to, late 60s and 70s. But there's something more this time that I want to point out, and let me come, directly to the implications for employment. Now, recently, I've been reading a paper which talks about job loss growth. So, we have been hearing about jobless growth for a long time now. Depending on how you look at the data, people have argued that jobless growth has characterized the Indian economy from 1980s, some say from 1990s. Some say there was a recovery in the first decade of this century, and then again jobless growth has resumed. But I have come across a new term, job loss growth, which means that not only are jobs not growing, it seems that the growth is taking place with net loss of jobs. So let me give you some figures. It appears that the industrial sector lost 3.5 million manufacturing sector jobs between 2011-12 and 2017-18. This is as per the NSSO employment service. The job loss, according to CMIE, there were job loss in the range of 6.2 million to 15.5 million, depending upon the population estimates used. Again, rural India actually lost 21 million. Urban India gained 15 million. So it's a rural India that is actually facing most of it, most of the brunt of this job loss. Open unemployment had risen from 3% to 8.8%. That is the highest in the last 45 years. More importantly, the labor force participation rate, that is those working or looking for work as a proportion of the population in the working age group, that is aged between 15 and 59 years, has declined from around 40% to about 37%. It means that discouraged workers are dropping out of the labor market due to lack of employment opportunities, even after accounting for those who are in education. And as we know, that is most pronounced in the case of women. So the point is that whether you look at consumption expenditure, whether you look at private sector investment, whether you look at exports, whether you look at aggregate growth figures, or you look at the employment, Indian economy was in a very precarious state, not seen in the last 50 years. Now, what happened as the pandemic hit us? It turns out that the sharp lockdown had its impact on the Indian economy. So, if you compare the April-June quarter of 2020 with the April-June quarter of 2019, then India is the worst performing economy. It the GDP shrunk by 23.9%. If you compare India to USA, USA's GDP shrunk by only 9.1%. The closest to India is United Kingdom, whose GDP shrunk in that quarter by 21%. By far, India was the worst hit by the pandemic in the quarter April to June of 2020. So this comes on top of that trend we've already discussed. we know that the social distancing measures, the strict lockdowns led to uh, fall in consumption, closure of units, and so on. So, according to some data, 6 million white collar workers, including engineers, physicians, teachers, accountants, and analysts, lost their jobs between May and August. That is not in the period April, May, but May and to August. That is when the economy was slowly being opened up. This is according to the CMIE data. The next biggest loss was among industrial workers, 5 million employees. So this comes on top of whatever is already happening. So I discussed, what was happening before the pandemic hit. Then I said that as the pandemic hit us, our economy contracted most sharply among other economies, and I gave some examples of the impact on the employment. Now, what did we do? And that's where I turn to policies. Now, there has been this different packages announced by the government at different points of time, uh, lockdown 1, 2, 3, or unlock 1, 2, 3 at different phases. Most of these packages, despite the total value of the package that has been announced, is mostly concerned with easing credit availability or tax reductions and so on, not directly in the not directly aimed at generating employment or boosting demand. The problem that we have seen is that there was already a pronounced lack of appetite for investment in the private sector. The pandemic has created a situation where consumption is going to fall not only because of the social distancing measures. I mean, imagine that you are not going to go to the cinema, you have not gone to the cinema halls, you have not gone to theaters, you are not going out on trips, you are not consuming a lot of stuff that you would consume. In addition, because of the lack of incomes due to the lockdown, there is no purchasing power. So it's all around lack of demand in the market. So whether it's private investment or consumption, there is a lack. There is very little of that in the market right now. Now, given this situation, the exclusive focus on tax swaps or credit availability or monetary easing appear to be quite puzzling, because these are all, as economists call it, supply side policies. So they basically enable, or they basically incentivize or encourage producers to produce more. But how are they going to produce more if there is no actual demand? So this whole thrust of the policy appears puzzling to begin with. And as a result, as you can see that normally economists always fight. And sometimes that's because of their intellectual commitments to some strand of economic thought. Sometimes it can be ideological or the political views. But this is the very rare occasion. Almost all economists agreed that what the government needs to do is not to spend less, but to spend more, to boost demand, to create employment, and to not worry about fiscal deficit or anything. It's one of the, I have never seen such a consensus among economists. Very few economists actually argue on the other side. So it's quite remarkable, what is actually driving, what is the thought process that's driving this policy decisions. Now, this becomes clear now when we look at what we call the Big Bang reforms that were announced in the last 3 months. And that gives a clue as to the thought process that is behind the response to the pandemic. What did the government do to reverse the hit that the economy took during the pandemic? They announced a slew of Big Bang reforms. The term big bang reforms in India became famous since 1991, economic reforms, and for a long while we have not heard this term. Now it is again back in currency as one reform after reform another has been announced in the last 3-4 months during the lockdown and as the lockdown began to be eased somewhat. So what were these reforms? Remarkable because these were all contentious reforms that were started uh, since 1991. 1991 reforms also came in the wake of an economic crisis. But the reforms in 1991 never went this far, in the sense that there are several areas of the reforms which were never really implemented. For example, labor market reforms, agricultural sector reforms, privatization. These were all reforms announced in the 1991 in the wake of the crisis of the balance of payments crisis, but they were never actually implemented fully. So those remain unfinished agenda as far as the reforms are concerned. Now, I'm not going to discuss the merits or demerits of the reforms. That is not the point. We don't have time for that. I'm just going to try to understand why these reforms now. That is the point I'm trying to understand. So what are the reforms are we talking about that could not be done since 1991, but was done in a couple of months during the pandemic? First, the agrarian reforms. The three bills, the Farmers Produce, Trade and Commerce Bill, the Farmers Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Bill, and the Essential Commodities Bill. The first bill, the Farmers Produce, Trade and Commerce Bill, will enable farmers to sell their produce anywhere they like. They don't have to sell it in the mandis, and they can sell it in the private markets. The argument is that it will break the monopoly of the regulated markets created by the APMC Act, right? And remove all restrictions on movement of farm produce inter-district or interstate. The problem was that APMC Act was supposed to break the monopoly of the private traders in agricultural agricultural farm produce. Now the argument has been reversed that it will break the monopoly of the mandis and the APMC. The problem is that according to some reports, only about 6% farmers actually sell their produce in these mandis at the MSP, the minimum support price. Most already sell their products in the private market at prices other than MSP. So the private trade, despite the APMC Act, had not gone away throughout all these years. And without trying to defend APMC and its associated processes, that is, I'm not trying to defend them. The problem is that it was already not in a monopolistic position. Most of the trade was already outside it. In certain states, yes, Punjab and Haryana, APMC and mandis played a bigger role, but not in most of the other states. So why now? Why do you need to open up the agricultural farm produce markets at this point of time? The second bill, Farmers Empowerment Protection Bill, will enable contract farming, ostensibly to facilitate better price discovery. And the third bill is the Essential Commodities Act Amendment Bill, which will facilitate private investment in cold storage because it sort of relaxes strict regulations on hoarding, against hoarding. So three bills together opens up the markets in agricultural farm produce. This is surprising because given the pandemic, given the movement of the migrant workers from one state to another, one of the major responses by state and central governments has been to provide food through PDAs. And one would have expected that procurement by the government in agricultural markets should be stepped up to enable the supply of provision of those the critical food items to these people affected by the pandemic to continue. But one sees just the opposite of that, sort of opening up the agricultural markets. Uh, then, many people were surprised by coal and mining sector reforms. For example, the coal mining blocks earlier were given to private players for only captive end use. Now they have been opened up for their own, they can purchase the coal mining blocks and subsequently sell them on the open market. And immediately 50 coal mining blocks were opened up for auction following this new law. Now one wonders, why this policy at this point of time? Because most of these mining and coal companies would remain on a wait and watch mode, because they would look at the demand, they will see where the demand is picking up, and then they will go for a mining. So given that they are not really scrambling for mines, why would this reform come at this point of time when demand is weak? The third major reform were, of course, the labor laws. Now, we are yet to see the legal fate of these laws that are passed at the state level. But the pressure on private sector companies to use these laws that have been passed in some state is quite, picking up. For example, some companies are saying that if we don't take advantage of this relaxation of the labor laws, then we would fall behind our competitors. So what kind of things have happened? In UP, Uttar Pradesh, all factories and establishments engaged in manufacturing process are exempted from all labor laws, blanket exemption for a period of 3 years to overcome the COVID, to overcome the problems faced during the COVID situation. In Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat, working time has been increased to about 72 hours in a week. And the new regulations allow working hours from increasing the working hours from 8 to 12 hours a day, and prohibit forming of any associations or unions. This pretty much takes us back to the 19th century. Now, in certain cases, I see that the court has struck down. I think the 72 hours provision has been struck down by the court recently. I have not read the judgment carefully, but I think it has been struck down by the Supreme Court. But what is the logic behind this? Logic behind this, of course, is that for the firms to rebound, they need some incentives, and labor laws has always been a problem. So if you relax the labor laws, the cost will go down, the flexibility will increase, and therefore it will be easier for the firms to rebound. We can continue talking about other policies like the changes in the MSME sector, the changes in the limits of FDI in defense, changes in the national education policy. The national education policy was adopted by the Union Cabinet in India on 29 July, without much discussion at the state level. So this was an egregious violation of a federal spirit. I mean, how can you have a national education policy adopted by the Union Cabinet without extensive discussion at the state level? So one could continue to talk about it, but let me just make one last point about the Big Bang reforms, and then I will stop giving the examples. The government has also announced during the lockdown that it will exit non-strategic sectors through privatization or strategic disinvestment. And even in few strategic sectors where it will continue to remain active, there will be a maximum of 4 public sector units, not more than that. As you know, it has already started. Air India and airports are already being privatized. The railways announced that 151 trains and 109 pairs of routes will be operated by private sectors. There is some talk about 4 PSU banks, the Punjab and Sindh Bank, the Bank of Maharashtra, UCO Bank, and IDBI Bank. that they would be disinvested and more or less that they might turn into private entities. The question again is, who is going to buy this? Who is going to buy these stakes that the government is willing to give up? If there is a loss, if the private sector doesn't have an appetite for investment, why would one expect that they will be picking up all the shares that the government wants to offload? Why would the private sector be interested in investing in PSU banks with large and increasing NPAs? So the point that I'm trying to say is that the immediate benefits of all these policies, I'm not getting into the merits or demerits of privatization. That's another debate. I'm trying to understand why this reform at this point, when it's even immediate benefits are not clear, given the slowdown in investment. We all know the rise in NPAs of these banks, so who would buy it? And therefore, it brings us to this crucial question. And why these big bang reforms and why now? And I've already mentioned in 1991, the whole set of reforms could not be implemented, not only in 1991, even in the 90s, even after that. And that was because of possible democratic resistance to many of these contentious policy reforms like agricultural reforms or labor law reforms and privatization and so on. So those remained unfinished agenda. It is precisely during a crisis, an unprecedented health crisis, an unprecedented situation of lockdown, where normal life is disrupted, that those unfinished agenda have been placed placed and passed. I am reminded of the book Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein used the term shock doctrine, described the brutal tactic of using the public's disorientation following a collective shock like wars or coups or terrorist attacks or market crashes or natural disasters to push through radical pro-corporate measures. This is akin to a shock therapy. Such shock therapies have been used in Chile in the 1970s, in Russia in the 1990s, in Argentina to some extent in the 1990s, to radically alter the policy architecture in favor of markets or corporate, big corporate actors. Shock tactics, according to Naomi Klein, follow a clear pattern. Wait for a crisis, or in some instances, as in Chile or Russia, help produce one, then declare a moment of what is sometimes called extraordinary politics, suspend some or most of democratic norms, and then ram the corporate wish list through as quickly as possible. If it is framed with sufficient hysteria by political leaders, for example, the danger of coronavirus, the crashing economy, in general, a climate of crisis, impending doom everywhere, this helps push through that agenda. This then reflects not a response to the problem that the pandemic created, a worsening of the situation that was unfolding in the previous 4 years, sort of exacerbated by previous policies like demonetization and GST and all that. It is not a response to the pandemic. It is a response which can aptly be understood as a shock therapy, to push through something that otherwise was difficult to push through for the last 30 years. This brings us to a discussion of how a crisis is represented, discussed, resisted, and thought about. Because this crisis allowed tremendous usurpation of tremendous amounts of power by the government, unprecedented degree of power by the government to intervene in our lives. Now, many of us are often grateful for strict lockdown or for strict enforcement of social distancing measures, and I'm not contesting that. But I would urge you to also think about what such assumption of power by the government means. It means that it can create a narrative of its own, make us feel scared, and then has the power to bypass all the institutional mechanisms of debate and discussion and protest and resistance, and can push to something that was found difficult to do in the last 30, impossible to do in the last 30 years. Remember, the same government had a majority between 2014 and 19. Even then, they could not push it through. These were all on their agenda. So it's not that they are not doing what they said that they would do, but they could not do in the period 2014 to 19. They could do it during a time when such power was handed over to the government willingly by the citizens. Crisis is a period when we ought to be more and more careful about what we are losing because of the chaos, the fear, all justified, of course, but we should be ever more watchful about what we are yielding to the government in return for safety and security and safety and security. The governments throughout, and if I don't have time to talk about that, but governments have always used apparatuses of security, to use Michel Foucault's words, have always used apparatuses of security to extend its reach of sovereign power, to extend its disciplinary techniques and other governmental techniques of power. Apparatuses of security are reassuring, and hence the most difficult for us to understand. These are not repressive apparatuses necessarily. These are all that protect us. And often the governments use such apparatuses of security to advance its unrestricted sovereign rights to enact policies often to the detriment of the public. In this case, responding to the health crisis in the form of lockdown and other measures, where those apparatuses of security that were pressed to the service of doing something that was completely different, that had nothing to do with addressing the health pandemic, nothing to do with addressing the economic fallout of the pandemic. It had to do with something that remained unfinished since 1991 and was on the wish list of one section of the population. I think that's why that's what we need to sort of think when we respond to what the government is doing. I'm not talking of any specific government. I think recently I was reading an interview of P. Sainath. P. Sainath has this wonderful terms which he picked up from some movies or novels, I don't remember. But he used this term. The UPA was a gang that could not shoot straight. The ND is a gang that just can't stop shooting. So I'm not talking of this government or that government. I'm just saying that one needs to be watchful of all governments and all policies. Thank you. I will stop here. I will take questions.
So a very thank you, sir, for unpacking these Big Bang Reforms 2.0 and also throwing some light on how the crisis has been used as a pretext for pushing political reforms and also unprecedented usurpation of power by the government. So now I open the floor for discussion and we can take questions now.
Hi, this is Shailendra.
Hi, Shailendra.
Thank you, sir, for the very informative presentation. My question is about the reversibility or irreversibility of these processes. Once these kind of reforms, be it the labor reforms or the in the farm sector or in the disinvestment, uh, since it took a crisis to roll them through or push them through, uh, do you think that it will take another crisis for some other government to roll it back? Because without a crisis, uh, in the absence of a crisis, these processes become difficult to reverse. Uh, what is your view on this reversibility of these processes which have been set through the pandemic?
No, yeah, Shalendra, I think it's a very good question. See, the point is, so there are two ways crisis occasions a change in policy, leads to a change in political economy. See, one is a crisis leads to a situation where drastic steps are necessary, right? That is one thing. For example, the crisis in the 60s and 70s also led to a drastic change in the policy regime. The nationalization of banks and insurance, those were all there in the Congress agendas before independence, but they got ultimately implemented at that point of time. Also, the whole the initiation of poverty alleviation programs started at that point of time, because that was a response to the findings that poverty had indeed increased despite state-led development through 5-year plans of the first 2 decades. So a crisis occasions rethinking and radical changes, no doubt. So that is not the that is not an issue. That is not, I think, the point that I was making. What I was talking about is, Naomi Klein's point that there is something about using a crisis to push through something that was not a response to the crisis, but essentially it was something that a certain group wanted to push through, an interest group wanted to push through, but had not been so far able to push through. It's mainly the big lobby, the big corporate lobby, or big global capital, or whatever. It might be different in different contexts. So that is what I'm trying to make a distinction between. A crisis occasions a response to the crisis, or a crisis occasions a response to something. It gives you a chance to respond to do something that is not a response to a crisis. In this case, all these big bang reforms were not a response to the crisis. These were reforms that were on the wish list for a long time. They were just pushed through using the crisis as a situation where normal democratic process of deliberation are suspended and confusion prevails, and people are scared. So I'm going to try to make a distinction between these two. And yes, so once these labor laws are changed, or PSUs are privatized, it's not going to be easy again to nationalize. And I'm not even saying that nationalization is a good thing for Air India or anything. One can perhaps, if privatization produces very negative outcomes, one can tackle it through certain appropriate regulations. Nationalization is just one form of tackling the negative fallouts of market or private sector. There can be other ways to tackle it. Labor laws, of course, it's with or without crisis, it depends on the bargaining power of the workers, this condition of the economy, and so on. So not all of these need to be reversed entirely, because the labor laws were applicable, we must remember, to very, very, very small percentage of Indian workers. So only in formal sector the labor laws apply. and that employs only 8%. Within that, there is a informal employment is the most predominant form. So essentially, it's a very small, tiny fraction of the Indian labor force that actually enjoy the benefits of the labor laws. Um, as I already said, that most of the farmers actually sold on the private markets outside the mandis. So they did not get the benefits of MSP or the government procurement agencies. In fact, there have been cases, again, I was referring to the interview of P. Sainath. There are many ways the government cheated the farmers before. For example, the case in Maharashtra that he referred to, where every time there was a crisis, economic crisis among the farmers, the government would increase the MSP, but then not procure the farm grains. They will start their procurement agencies later, close it earlier, and open less than the required number of procurement outlets. So the governments have cheated farmers all along. So these reforms may not, we do not know whether these reforms are particularly going to hurt them more than the way they were already being hurt. So we may not need to radically reverse all of this. Appropriate regulations can be formed to support farmers, particularly with FPOs, farmer organizations, farmer producer organizations. Those could be strengthened and so on. The point that I'm trying to make is how do we look at government policy making? How do we read, quote unquote, policy making? Particularly in a crisis period. How do we make sense of this? Economists have been writing about the need for certain kind of policies to handle this emergency. And they have been saying the it's demand side, not supply side policies that are necessary. But this is completely different. This is not even your just standard supply side measures. This is like what the newspapers call big bang reforms, and passed off as solutions to the COVID situation. And the way, it's the art of politics that enabled the government to pass this when it had absolutely no relevance to the current situation. I think it's that side of the politics that I'm drawing attention to. Yeah.
Thank you.
So if there are any other questions.
I have a question. Hi, Rajesh. It was good to hear you, and it was perfectly lucid. Completely agree with all of your points on disaster capitalism. I just wanted to ask you something which has been troubling me, which I'm trying to wrap my head around, which is that, I mean, the whole obvious relationship between Hindu majoritarianism and what we see as disaster capitalism unfold in the last few months. And that's something which, as obviously one is fueling the other, but I'm trying to figure out how this plays out, because obviously when you see this kind of dispossession at the level of the masses, right? Your labor laws are being undone. Livelihoods are lost. What does that imply for what we see as Hindu fundamentalism, right? Because if you see Naomi Klein's narrative also of disaster capitalism, it's also accompanying a rise thereafter in white supremacy, Islamophobia, etc. Right? So, and I mean, I think living in days where we're dealing with upper caste rapes of Dalits and everything, all other violence which is related to Hindu majoritarianism, right? Which is kind of unhindered. So, yeah, any thoughts on this? And its relation to these economic reforms that we've been talking about, specifically disaster capitalism.
So, frankly speaking, Devi, I'm trying to figure out, what is the economic model here that's going to support the Hindu vegetarianism, which is the ideological position of the dominant ruling coalition. I'm not sure I'm finding a link. So, that's where I would say that the link is very fragile between the economic policies that they are undertaking and the political ideology that they are committed to. So far, I think they have managed to get the electoral victories through certain well-crafted, relatively well-crafted delivery systems of certain welfare benefits, some big-ticket welfare schemes for farmers and so on, coupled with great, communications. So those steps have sort of ameliorated the negative impact of some of the earlier policies. For example, a lot, I think the rural economy has been hurt pretty badly for various reasons. For example, the ban on cow slaughter, starting from that, the demonetization and all of that. Now, to ameliorate that impact, and remember, the ban on cow slaughter is not only related to the industry which employed people, but also it was a rural cattle market, right? And the loss in the value of the livestock of the farmers. So it's a whole part of the rural economy that has been affected. Then there was the demonetization, of course. This was sort of ameliorated through certain policies like through certain schemes like the ones that were announced just before the elections, 2019. A monthly, an annual income transfer to the farmers of a certain, amount. This was also legislated by the states, but the central government also did it. So in some ways, these ameliorative steps have been taken to counter the dispossession and the radical disruption that have been experienced by the rural folks. Overall, however, I'm not seeing a whole model, an economic model to support the political agenda. I'm finding it difficult to understand. So one can see, for example, a concern among the affiliate organizations of the ruling dispensation, like, the RSS and other affiliates who are talking about small businesses, who are talking about Swadeshi and all that. So I guess in certain cases, those concerns are accommodated. But then you see these reforms that are quite worrying. For example, there has been a change in the MSME definition in the last 3 months. Now, the changing the MSME definition and raising the limits, the definition, the limits of turnover or investment, there are 3 criteria, means a lot of bigger firms within the MSME sector will now come in.
Yeah.
And the small businesses will suffer.
Yeah.
Now, when you bring that, I'm not very sure where they're going with this economic agenda. To me, it's not very clear that even the corporate sector wants these policies. Frankly speaking, I don't think any corporate sector would think that this is in the long-term interest of private investment. I'm not even sure that they will want this reforms agenda right now. What are they going to do with this? What are they going to do with privatization right now? What are they going to do with coal mining reforms right now? It's not something they would know. So it is true that these were on the wish list. Maybe a section of big corporate wanted this to be done because of the opportune moment. But this is not what even the corporate sector needs right now. So this does not yield an economic model that can support its political ideology. I'm definitely not pro-people. We can rule that out. And I am not even sure that it is in the interest of the corporate. So I'm actually baffled, except for this one thing, that maybe these were lying around on the reforms agenda for long, and somebody or some lobby said that this is the time, just push it through. Apart from that, it plays no function. And I think it's this whole idea that it's still disregard for democratic deliberations. It's just that the opportunity is available. Let's just do it. I think this is the mindset which is most troubling for me. It is the mindset that lies behind majoritarianism. Because we're majority, let's do what we can. Who can stop us? It's the same mindset at work here. We have got an opportunity, so let's do it. It is to no one's benefit.
Thank you. I'll probably carry on this discussion with you sometime.
Yeah, sure.
Any other
This is
questions?
Shailendra. This is Shailendra. Just one comment to Professor Vijay's question. I think the majoritarian government, one connection that I think is that a majoritarian dispensation thinks that there is no political cost of its economic policy now. So it finds a disconnect between its economic policy or the ability of its economic policy to, convert itself into a political cost to them. So a majoritarian thought process thrives on that there is no political cost to its actions. So maybe this may be a tenuous link, if at all, that between the ideology and the economic policy.
Sure, thank you for that. Yeah. No, clearly there is, this whole notion of distract and rule, right? So you can put this in front and behind the scene, everything else happens. But there's a certain notion of identity, and which is, I guess, where Rajesh is saying that you have to go beyond the language of economics to understand what is going on. But yeah, but thanks, Shailendra.
So I have a question. Yeah. So as we were talking about that the only 6% of the farmers are using mandis and more than 90% of the population is informal sector. And with there is a disconnect between what we can say the political market and the economic market. So they can continue their policies to support the disaster capitalism with their favorite in the plate, because if we look at the mining, the one particular group will get all the benefit, and at another side they can continue to harness the political power to a market which is not directly linked in the formal market or formal institutions. So they are basically milking. On the one hand, they are giving high value profit to the private player, and on the another hand, they are using emotive slogans like national security or something else to get the political power. So it makes a sense because their political power is not coming from what we say that is not connected with the economic reforms or Big Bang reform what they are doing. So even if it will impact a minority of sectors and they will still be in power, but their favorite in the state will get a lot of value, maybe or may not be, but they are doing that. Or another, it can be that they are incompetent, so they have to do something, and that's why they are doing.
Yeah. So actually, if these reforms were done in the period of, let's say, 2003 to 10, I would have understood it. If it was done in between 2014 to 2017, I would have understood it. I'm not understanding it when it comes now. And the reason is that the indicators are there. The corporate sector is not, it does not have the assurance that the market is there to invest. To boost the confidence of the corporate sector, the government needs to, boost demand, do something to, sort of say that the market is out there, go ahead and produce. If they had done it along with labor laws, relaxation, I could still understand that. But what they're doing now is going to actually bring the economy to a disaster if it is not already there. And I think this large-scale confusion and doubt over data is a major, is because the data can't be actually released at this point of time. It would be really frightening if the real data came out. Because it is difficult for us to believe that after all these 70 years of independence, we are back to a situation like in the 1670s. The entire hype that has been built up around India's growth story will come crashing down. It is coming crashing down. And if we might say that it is due to COVID, COVID has only accelerated it. It was already going down. And that's why I'm worried that, national defense, China, Pakistan, everything can be played out. But there has to be also a model, economic model that goes along with that Mediterranean thing. I find it difficult to understand how even the political ideology will succeed without a supporting economic model. I mean, if you look at other cases, in rest of the world, there was something that went ahead with it, the political agenda. It's not just by itself that it was sustainable. You got to have something going on the economic front as well. And I don't see that. So it's a very strange what Devi asked me, and I sort of fumbled because I don't have an answer actually. I've been trying to make sense of these almost, policies that seem to be going against everyone, including the big corporate, including the vote base of the BJP and so on. So it's sort of baffling. I still think they are in search for a model, and I do not know if there is a model given the sharpening crisis of India.
Just I just have another clarificatory comment. Like, I mean, whatever it. I mean, one thing it would be a put from a majoritarian type of system to a dictator type, where only few cooperate. So they are not really really concerned about the entire corporate sector, but only few cooperate who will be with them in any condition. So they really don't want that the corporate sector to survive, and only 2 or 3 players will be there, and it will be a dictatorial form of government where 2 or 3 players are supporting them at any cost, and then they can be to. We can see in the. I think we should start thinking in those directions rather than just in the economic sense.
And can I just add to what Anuj is saying actually? So the other thing we were trying to understand is that if it is in nobody's interest and if it's really not such a big bang reform, maybe it's just the central government trying to reclaim the policy space from the multiple sovereigns of like the different states or local level governments or stuff like that, because the discourse of the last 30 years has been towards more devolution and decentralization. And here comes an opportunity where you appropriate that space, at least in the mining sector. We clearly know that they have used this opportunity to usurp whatever the limited powers that the state governments had and push through these reforms without any consultation. So it's basically just trying to say that we are the only boss and not so much the states. And then,
No, definitely it's a centralizing tendency, whether you talk, that's why I sort of mentioned the national education policy as a clear example of completely violating the federal spirit and, rolling back on the decentralization. I completely agree with that. I didn't mean to say that the reforms are not helpful for the corporate. They are in the longer term. Definitely. That's why I said they were on the wish list and they get implemented now. I'm saying that this is an opportune moment for pushing it through. But this alone at this point of time, in the short term, is not going to be useful for the corporate by itself. That's the point I was trying to make. I'm not saying that these are not useful for the corporate. Okay. In the long run. I mean, in the sense that they think that it's useful, right? So yes, in the long run, it will be useful. But right now, I don't see the entire coal or mining industry being terribly excited about all these blocks. Given the slowdown, the subdued demand throughout the world, I'm not very sure why they would be elated with this in the short term. In the long term, yes, you're right. Similarly, privatization. I don't see why stressed public sector banks should be so attractive. An airlines industry that has been in doldrums for so long should be so attractive, including sale of airports and Air India and all the restrictions on air travel that are going to continue for several times. So will be so attractive in the short run. So I'm not saying these are not useful, but they needed something more, which they are not getting. So that's why I'm saying that it is not a response to the current situation. But yes, you are right that in the long run, this might be in benefit to the benefit of the corporate, and that's what they're trying to do. But then who knows? In the long run, as Ken said, we are dead. And so Anuj, on the other point of the monopoly, yeah, so there could be like one or two big, so we are talking of oligarchy and all that. Yes, that is possible. I doubt whether that, I don't know, I mean, I doubt whether that configuration would work in a country as large as India. So I'm not very sure that that is feasible politically.
Yeah, because
that is a model that can of course be tried, but I'm not very sure that would work out in a country as large as India.
Because despite the economic downturn in the last 2-3 years, if we look particularly Telgroup, they have invested heavily. I mean, they are buying everything from transport to telecommunication. So we can see clear concentration of economic power also.
Yeah, sure. But I'm saying that I don't see it as consolidating as a model that can be sustained for any any period, any duration. I mean, I don't see it. I find it very difficult to understand, to kind of imagine it in a country as large as India. If India was a smaller country, yes, of course, definitely that would be possible. All the signs are there. I'm just not sure it would work out in a country like India. But yes, who knows?
So, are there any other questions?
Hi, Rajesh, Chetan here.
Hi, Chetan.
Thank you for listening to your talk. I wanted to ask a little bit kind of a distraction from the flow which you are in. Any thoughts on how demand can be pepped up? Whether the traditional ways will apply, or given the crisis, some new methods are needed?
Well, so among the new methods, so yes, I think the traditional methods will still work out. I mean, government spending on infrastructure, which is badly needed, could both help the supply side through infrastructure build-up, and also creating employment and income. Direct income transfer, that would itself create a lot of good for the economy. But innovative ways, if you ask me, I think one major innovative way to create demand would be to just focus on the health situation itself. You see, a lot of employment is needed in the management of the health situation right now. And I'm not talking of frontline health workers. I'm not talking of experts. I'm not talking about people working in the clinics and hospitals. And I'm talking about a force, a volunteer force that would work at a neighborhood level, at the village level, trying to provide the services that the people need if they fall sick, trying to find out if the people are falling sick, trying to spread the message that even if you fall sick, it's not something to hide, or the other people to understand that you don't ostracize someone because someone is sick. These are the ways that can actually handle the pandemic and at the same time, create employment. And if you look at the scale of the pandemic and the duration for which this has been going on and can continue to go on, this is a large-scale employment in the both villages and cities that I can see immediately creating employment as well as incomes and therefore demand. So I don't see why we don't go for at least temporary employment schemes like this. For next 1 or 2 years, let's just enlist as many thousands of people who are, who are available, and let's just employ them. And I think it's absolutely essential right now. Many people are suffering because of that. There's someone very close, relative, very close to my wife, who has fallen, ill due to COVID and has been hospitalized. And his wife is alone at home, right? Yes, what Rene is saying, local kitchens and all of that. There is a wife at home alone, and they were not able to take a picture of the report to send to the doctor. So Amrita, my wife, had to go and take a picture and send it to the report, and then the doctor could give advice. There's all the small things. Some people just need some company. Some people need some grocery and so on. These are absolutely necessary, and awareness is the most important thing. That is also necessary. And if you ask me, socially, which I mentioned at the very beginning, that was my first sentence. This pandemic has really put stress on connection between individuals because of the strict quarantine, social distancing. We need to build the social ties themselves. And that is also possible through these initiatives at the local level, through, community kitchens, or, all these other mechanisms. So a lot of employment can be created right now in the management of health itself, apart from the usual traditional methods of creation of employment, which are necessary in this point.
Thank you, Rajesh and Rona, both.
So, do we have any more questions? So Rishabh is asking a question on the chat. So his question is,
tell me. Yeah.
So this was in Hindu. One of the economic professors from somewhere had written that the new agricultural reforms would lead to balkanization of India. Now, can you trace that chain? I did not understand. Like unifying market will lead to balkanization.
Well, I have to read the article. I am not getting the immediate connection. So I don't know what the author meant. Again, one needs to understand that I was watching this documentary, Super Size Me 2, right? There was this earlier documentary, Super Size Me, and now this new one. And it's about US food industry, chicken growers and the big chicken companies who buy their product. So these are all examples of contract farming, right? And if it's on Netflix, so if you have time, just go ahead and watch the documentary. It helps you understand contract farming between farmers and, in this case, chicken farmers and the big companies, and how the terms of contract can be manipulated in such a way the farmers remain vulnerable. And we are not talking about poor farmers with 2 hectares of land in India. We are talking about chicken farmers who have taken millions of dollars of loan to have huge houses to grow millions of chickens per year. Even then, they are literally vulnerable. The way they are talking in that documentary, you will be surprised to see that some feels like you are an Indian smallholder peasant is talking, and it's because of the contract and the specifications and how the quality is judged and controlled, and how the payment is actually made based on the delivery of your output. So it's a very complicated system that basically keeps them indebted. I was surprised to see that they are forever indebted. These American chicken farmers, large, okay, because they're always required to take loans and upgrade, and they never get the money back when they supplied out. So if this is happening in USA, imagine what can happen in India with such contract farming being enabled. So again, I'm not taking sides against or for the new reforms bills. As I said, even the previous situation was not really benefiting the farmers. I told you of the Maharashtra case, right? The government used to announce high MSP and then don't procure it. As simple as that. But those who think that it would be a dream come true, like the market is opened up and contract farming would immediately double farmers' incomes, as is being said. That's not the case. That's not the case even in developed markets like USA. So I doubt whether that will be the case for the small farmers, absolutely helpless, vulnerable farmers in India. So I do not know in what sense they're talking about it. Maybe some of the larger farmers can benefit from it in certain parts of India, but in most of the parts of India where there are very, very small small and marginal peasants, I doubt that's going to radically alter their improve their incomes.
So
Yeah,
that's
Priyanshu, I think urban employment guarantee scheme in general is very important, and yeah, as I said, management of it itself is an important area where such employment is needed. And they will, yes, stop paying your rates. Why not? Agree completely.
Yeah, bring the system down.
Yeah.
So that was a very insightful talk and a very rich and a productive discussion. Thank you, sir, for unpacking the politics of the pandemic. And thanks to everyone for joining this discussion. The recording of this session would be available on YouTube. And you can find about the upcoming sessions of Radio Sophia from the page on Facebook and join us for the upcoming sessions. Thank you.